To understand Grainline, you first have to understand selvage. And selvage is just the self-finished edge of the fabric, the edge that doesn't ravel or fray. It's actually the edge that was attached to the side of the loom when it was woven. So now let me show you what selvage and Grainline looks like on a real piece of fabric. On a real piece of fabric, you'll find an edge that's either completely finished, or as in this example, you'll see a little bit of a fringe, but also have the finished unraveling edge just above that. Sometimes it looks a little different. Sometimes it has a wider band, like this one that has the white, but they're both selvage. Not all selvages look exactly the same, so I want to show you another selvage. This one's a smooth edge selvage. It's still got that edge that doesn't ravel, so it doesn't pull threads off. The other kind doesn't pull threads off or ravel either, even though it has a fringe. But they just look different. One is smooth and one has a bit of a fringe to it. Now let's talk about the grain line on this fabric. In the earlier slide, we talked about how the grain line is parallel with the selvage. So I'm going to draw a line here that indicates where the grain line is. So this would be considered on grain. The other thing that we talked about in the previous slide is the cross grain, which is perpendicular to the selvage. So we're going to mark this line our cross grain. The perpendicular line is the cross grain. The next thing I want to talk about is the bias. A ruler like this will be really helpful. The lines on the ruler have 45-degree angles that you can line up with the selvage like I'm doing here. Now just draw that line and you've got the 45-degree angle line. That is our bias. All right, so there's the three different types of lines that we're talking about today. But why do we care about these? So I want to talk just a little bit about that. When you look at this grain line and you pull on the grain, you'll notice it really doesn't have any stretch. It's pretty tight that direction, but when you flip it around and you look at the cross grain, there's a little bit more stretch. Not a lot, but just a little bit. But now when we turn and we pull on the bias, now we see a lot more stretch. That's why we care about these grain lines. If you cut a garment on the bias that's intended to be cut on the grain, it's going to twist and stretch in areas you hadn't intended. Before you lay any pattern pieces on your fabric, you want to make sure it's laid out on grain. What I'm doing here is I am tearing strips across the cross grain to make sure that it's on grain on that cut edge. You have to make sure your tear goes all the way from one selvage to the other, so sometimes it takes more than one attempt like it did in this example. If your fabric won't tear, then you can use the thread pull method. You see I've snipped into the fabric and I've pulled a thread that I'm going to pull across the fabric. I'm going to just keep easing it down like this. So you notice I'm just continuing to pull the thread and spread out the fabric. It's kind of like gathering. You're just pulling that thread. It's not uncommon at all for a thread to break like that one just did. You just spread your fabric back out, and you can't see it on camera probably, but I can see a little channel in the fabric where that thread was. So I'm just cutting down that channel till I can't see it anymore and starting again. You just repeat that process over and over again till you get all the way to the other selvage edge. I won't continue to do that here because it takes a little while, but now you know how to do it. Now that you've trued up that cut edge on the cross grain and got it aligned, it's time to lay your fabric out. Don't skip this step, don't skimp on it. You really want to align the cut edge and align the selvage edge and smooth the fabric out nice and smooth. You're looking for, can you get a nice smooth edge on the fold that doesn't have any little ripples or pulls or pleat looking things in it. In this example, the fold looks beautiful. There's no ripples or anything, so we don't need to do anything. But if it weren't, you could pop it into alignment by grabbing diagonally and pulling with a pop. And it usually will put it back into grain. So now we're on grain, we're ready to put this pattern piece on the fabric. There's our grain line marking on our pattern piece. We're going to want to lay that on properly. So we lay it on in alignment parallel to the grain line. I'm measuring from one end of that grain line on the pattern to the selvage edge. In this case, it's 3 inches. So I'm going to put a pin there so it doesn't shift on me. I'm going to go down to the other end and I'm going to make sure that it is at 3 inches also and put a pin there. Once I've done that, I've got my pattern on the fabric on the grain line.